Mark it well, counselors. Silence is not safety. Varric Sen's voice split the stillness like a fault line cracking open beneath ancient stone. He stood alone at the foot of the Cordanis assembly chamber, the towering tribunal dais rising before him, its gold-veined obsidian walls catching the sharp glint of the station's orbital light. Around him, rows of delegates shifted in their high-backed chairs, their silk-cord uniforms brushing softly against alloy armrests. The air was dry, sharp, carrying the faint bite of sterilization fields active just beyond the threshold. A muted tension rippled across the chamber, a hesitation too faint for the untrained to name, but Varric had marched through fields of ash and heard better men ignore their instincts. High Strategist Tharn Dravik leaned forward on the uppermost tier, fingers steepled beneath the cold gleam of a laser plasma insignia flickering overhead. His voice slid out smooth, almost indulgent. Varric Sen, survivor, historian, specter of a war no one remembers. Tell us what grand threat sleeps under Earth's silent crust. The gallery chuckled, a dry, shallow sound like sand scraping over a hollow drum. Varric's one good eye flicked over them, gauging reactions, watching the same pattern play out as it had decades before. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he let the silence bloom, an old soldier's weapon. Memories stirred in the weighted air, unbidden but fierce, fractured fleets swallowed by nothingness, sensor echoes howling like dying stars across broken hulls. Varric tapped the worn disc pinned to his chest, a battered service medal, its edges dulled by years of disregard. He inhaled, catching the sterile scent of ionized air, and when he spoke again, his voice had the gravel of broken promises. You measure strength by the noise it makes. His gaze swept them, each word deliberate, heavier than the last. You think absence is submission, you see nothing, and believe it's because there's nothing left to fear. A laser plasma heads-up display above the council dais flickered briefly, recalibrating as it projected planetary data streams in lazy arcs. Earth, tiny and dormant, rotated serenely in the center, harmless, outdated, conquered by time. Young envoy Morin Vix, sharp-cloaked and smug, leaned sideways in his chair, speaking loud enough to ripple through the room. Humans haven't left their orbit in 72 cycles. Their fleets rust under clouds they can't even pierce anymore. He paused, tossing a thin silver datapad onto his desk with a careless clatter. Tell us, Varric, what ghost fleet haunts your dreams? The laughter this time rolled warmer, more confident, like a feast table where the last fool had finally been chased from the hall. Varric's lips didn't so much as twitch. His bones ached with the memory of things these men had never tasted, fear sharp as blood on the tongue, the rending silence after a fleet's final breath. He stepped forward once, boots scraping softly against the polished volcanic glass underfoot. A low chime reverberated from the chamber's outer walls as the station adjusted orbit, a groan like distant thunder, a reminder of the void just beyond. I do not speak of dreams. Varric's gaze found Tharn Dravik and locked there unyielding. I speak of foundations laid under your very feet while you celebrated their defeat. I speak of scars buried beneath treaties you never rid. I speak of the weight of consequences delayed, not diffused. Dravik's expression flickered, a momentary lapse, the shadow of a frown. The high strategist exhaled slowly, his breath stirring the faintest disturbance across his desk's glowing interface. He tapped a sequence, and Earth's projection on the display shrank further, an irrelevant point of blue swallowed by the map's grander politics. Old fears, Varric. Dravik's voice was quieter now, dismissive but strained. Relics from a time when humanity mattered. The old soldier's throat burned with the weight of knowing he could not save them. He could only watch them stumble toward the cliff's edge, laughing at the wind's warnings. He straightened, his spine protesting under the weight of gravity and memory. You believe the stars belong to you because you have forgotten who taught you to fear the dark. Silence answered him. Beyond the curved dome of the chamber's ceiling, the stars gleamed like old scars, faint and cold. The counselors sat, shuffling datapads, exchanging glances. Some masked their discomfort behind polite yawns, others smirked openly, the game already decided. Varric's eyes, one a faded steel gray, the other a milky relic of radiation burns, swept them once more. He pressed two fingers briefly to his service disc, a soldier's final salute, not to them, but to the men and women who had fought alongside him long ago, whose names would never find purchase in these marble halls. He turned. His footsteps were deliberate, their echoes ringing sharper than the council's hollow laughter. As he passed the final row of delegates, Morin Vix leaned in again, voice dripping amusement. "Walk away, fossil. Earth's time passed before your bones turned brittle." Varak did not slow. He did not look back. As the chamber doors sealed behind him with a muted shudder, the scent of old iron lingered in his nose, the memory of shattered hulls and burning decks, and the subtle taste of copper at the back of his throat reminded him that history ignored would demand blood once again. He stepped into the wide station corridor, the lights running thin and cold along the edges of the floor, giving the world a skeletal look. Outside the transparent observation windows, the swirling gas fields of Cordanis shimmered gold and violet, restless in their eternal storm. Varak stood a moment longer, the weight of centuries pressing against his skin. From somewhere deep within the station, a tremor barely kissed the soles of his boots, the movement of fleets aligning, of plans unfurling. He closed his eyes, hearing the old symphony return, the silent scream of a disappearing battle group, the fluttering death of comets disturbed from orbit, the distant wail of fractured space. Let history record it. Today we lock the last coffin. High Strategist Tharn Dravik's words cut through the council chamber as he rose, robes snapping sharply against his boots. The overhead laser plasma display flared, painting a rigid constellation of Earth's resource grids across the far wall, blue points marked for reassignment, red sigils already blinking into seizure protocols. A ripple of approval moved through the room, muted but certain. The delegates sat straighter, shoulders drawing back beneath ceremonial sashes threaded with the deep iron gray of authority. The crisp tang of filtered air brushed their skin as the station's environmental systems shifted to accommodate the surge of bodies gathering to witness the final vote. Dravik's fingers brushed a control rune, embedded in the dais before him. A slender stylus unfolded from its cradle, catching the overhead light with a faint glimmer. "Proceed," he commanded. His voice bore the weight of inevitability. The stylus etched names into the interactive surface below, each signature flaring once, then sinking into the record like anchors. The act itself carried ceremony, each flash of light a nail hammered into history's framework. "Motion to implement acid quietude," Dravik intoned. Seconded by Rax Duran, endorsed by Envoy Vix. Morin Vix, still lounging with the easy arrogance of the untouched, tapped his authorization rune with a lazy flick. He offered no words, only a tight-lipped smirk. Varak's absence pressed against the edges of the chamber like an unwelcome ghost. In the observation galleries above, aides shifted, their muted conversations swallowed by the thick weave of soundproofing screens. From behind the smoked crystal partitions, occasional flickers of movement betrayed hidden watchers, each face half lit by the cold gleam of surveillance feeds. As the final signatures seared into permanence, the council's banners unfurled from the ceiling, thick, jet-black cloth heavy with embroidered silver knots. They descended like slow-falling verdicts, casting elongated shadows across the chamber's floor. Dravik lifted his gaze to the assembly. His eyes, pale as ground stone, swept the room. "No retaliation, no movement, no objection," he said, almost contemplative. His voice softened, sliding into something near wonder. "Earth will become a memory, nothing more." Keller Day, a junior operations officer tucked into the lower tiers, fidgeted as his heads-up display fed live logistics updates directly into his retinal overlay. Tiny red markers flickered at the edges of his vision, confirmation pings from captured satellites, rerouted supply channels sealing tight like surgical incisions. He bit the inside of his cheek, tasting iron, and said nothing. A comms chime rang, crisp and melodic. Sector Jullan grids tethered successfully. "Cargo redirection in effect," announced a dispatch officer from his recessed console, voice mechanical, stripped of inflection by procedural protocol. Morin Vix leaned back in his chair, hands laced behind his head. "Congratulations, High Strategist. You've outlived the last ghost story." Dravik allowed himself the smallest curve of a smile, something brittle, something dangerous. "Ghosts do not contest the living." The chamber's main display shifted to a rotating diagram of resource projections, credits ticking upward in a steady green surge. The councilors watched, some with narrowed eyes, others allowing themselves the luxury of relaxation. The scent of new parchment from freshly printed decrees mingled with the ozone of the station's internal ion scrubbers, a sterile tang that clung to the back of the throat. Dravik stepped from the dais, robes trailing like smoke. He moved to the council's central platform, where a control rod awaited. Gripping it firmly, he pressed his thumb to the biometric lock. The station shivered. Across the stars, across the frozen arc of the Jullan sector, Earth's scattered mining platforms flickered under seizure protocols. Automated drones bearing the crest of the Triumvirate latched onto orbital assets, transmitting ownership pings back to Cordanis. Heads-up displays updated seamlessly, grids reassigning to Triumvirate jurisdiction, lines shifted. Maps rewrote themselves in real time, swallowing centuries-old demarcations without ceremony. A junior tech muttered at his station. Grid 47, responding slower than standard. Minor lag. Dravik's glance was quick, cutting, adjust buffering, prioritize asset lock. The tech flushed, nodding sharply. His fingers danced over the controls, rerouting power with nervous precision. Morin Vix chuckled softly, just under his breath. Old tech, probably rusted through. No one laughed with him this time. The banners overhead stirred faintly in the station's recycled currents, long black tongues tasting the air. Dravik keyed the council-wide address line, his voice broadcasting to every deck, every corridor, every listening ear aboard Cordanis. Let it be known, he said, that Earth in its silence has surrendered, and from this day the guardianship of its abandoned holdings falls to the Triumvirate. The words rolled outward, filling the station with finality. In the command tiers, Keller Day swallowed hard, a pulse thrumming at the hollow of his throat. He could feel it, something beneath the surface of the moment, something waiting. He shook off the thought. Orders were orders. Far beyond the council walls, sensor buoys drifted like sleeping sentinels. Triumvirate flags blinked into existence across the mining rings, markers of a silent conquest. A console somewhere near the rear emitted a tiny arrhythmic chirp. No one noticed. Dravik turned back toward the assembly. This will be our legacy, he said quietly. The day the last threat to peace disappeared. Morin Vix stretched lazily, the leather of his uniform creaking softly. Already feels safer. The council began to rise, robes fluttering against the static-charged air. Conversations resumed in low tones, laughter punctuating the spaces between. The smell of sterilized parchment hung heavier now, mingling with the sharper tang of burnt data sigils decommissioned by the decree. No one noticed the brief flicker across the main heads-up display. A faint distortion, gone before conscious minds could register it. Keller Day blinked, trying to catch it again. His retinal overlay flared momentarily, a single word flashing at the edge of his sight, scrambled, meaningless. He rubbed his eyes, chalked it up to fatigue, and turned back to his console. The council exited in formal lines, the banners overhead drawing upward, vanishing into hidden alcoves with a sound like bones settling into dust. The black seals of the Triumvirate gleamed briefly under the plasma lights, catching the restless colors of the station's rotation. Signal drift on Grid 47. Adjust trajectory sweep. Keller Day's voice cut through the command tier, low and clipped. He leaned over his console, the glow from the laser plasma display striping his face in bands of ghostly white. Rows of resource routes spiraled in tight formation across the surface of the heads-up display, each pulse marking a mining platform newly claimed. Around him, the operations pit hummed, not with engines, but with the soft, ceaseless murmur of data being sifted, sorted, judged. The crisp scent of charged glass hung in the recycled air, tingling faintly in his nose. One by one, the satellite grids blinked their compliance. Except for one, Grid 47. A thin vertical line trembled along its trajectory display, twitching unnaturally. Keller frowned, tapping a control node to bring the beacon feed into sharper relief. Static bled at the edges of the signal, snowing softly across the data stream like ash. He flagged it for recalibration. Across the tier, Morin Vix sprawled in a high-backed chair, balancing a glass of spiced hydrocor between two fingers. He swirled the drink lazily, the amber liquid catching the soft overhead light. Still chasing ghosts, Day? His voice carried the easy contempt of someone with nothing to lose. Keller stiffened, but said nothing, his attention flicking back to the stuttering feed. In the shadow of the main observation window, Tharn Dravik stood silent, arms folded. He watched Earth's tiny outline spin slowly in the distance, a muted blue winking against the darker churn of the gas fields beyond. The planet looked defenseless. Dravik's lips pressed into a thin line. He had seen predators curl into silence before striking, but Earth had been still for so long. It no longer seemed capable of movement at all. A comms officer broke the heavy quiet. Cargo vessel Turnus Red reports delay. Adjusted arrival time, pending. Dravik turned, the single word sharp enough to slice. The officer, a slender figure nearly swallowed by his duty harness, swallowed hard. Navigation feed reports, repeat signal loops. Estimated arrival paths don't align with updated drift factors. Vix chuckled from his seat. Translation: they forgot how to steer. Another murmur of laughter. Dravik said nothing, merely gestured for the officer to continue. Outside the main viewport, a nearby mining beacon flickered twice before vanishing entirely, its locator flare collapsing inward without fanfare. No one spoke. Keller shifted his gaze back to Grid 47. A second beacon now danced irregularly along its vector path, pulsing like a wounded heartbeat. He rubbed his palms together, feeling the thin rasp of the station's recycled air clinging to his skin. The atmosphere tasted filtered but dry, as if the station itself anticipated trouble it could not voice. The council chambers remained a low churn of muted conversations. Morin Vix tossed back the last of his hydrocore and slammed the glass down, the sound sharp against the polished deck. Maybe Earth's systems are decaying faster than we thought, he offered too brightly. Rust runs deep in abandoned veins. Dravik's gaze remained fixed on the drifting grid diagrams, unblinking. Another alert flashed at Keller's station, a minor alarm, easily dismissed. Another mining satellite, Grid 32, had disappeared from tracking telemetry. Not exploded, not destroyed, just gone. The kind of vanishing that left no debris field, no radiation spike, no directional echo. Keller hesitated. His fingers hovered above the acknowledgement command. A hollow clunk echoed from the data center far below, where cooling fans struggled under sudden, unseen loads. The sound rolled up through the decks like a heartbeat trapped behind stone. Grid loss recorded, Keller said carefully. No external events logged. Dravik's brow furrowed. Verify backup telemetry. Keller's hands moved quickly, slicing through command hierarchies, opening channels that should have yielded a flood of auxiliary data. Only silence answered, wrapped around them like wet cloth. One by one, the heads-up display nodes along the observation tier began to flicker, not malfunctioning, stalling. Images froze mid-frame. Data feeds staggered in place. Something unseen pressed against the edges of the station's nerve center. Secondary buoys offline, reported a voice from the far end of the pit. No diagnostics available. Vix pushed himself upright at last, his earlier bravado bleeding away into a tight, irritated line. Glitch storm, he muttered. Reboot the system clusters. The suggestion hung hollow in the stale air. Dravik stepped down from the command platform, boots whispering against the stone-textured flooring. His stride carried no hesitation, but Keller saw the faint tick in his jaw, the barest crack in the counselor's composed facade. Outside, in the cold black, the stars seemed to lean closer. Earth remained motionless, a blue shard against the dark. A second cargo ship, Valaris Gray, missed its scheduled checkpoint. No distress signal, no telemetry burst, only a missing name in the registry logs, blinking in soft red on the command console. The station's environmental systems stirred uneasily, vents cycling with an almost imperceptible shudder. Dravik's voice broke the growing tension. Send a relay to all operational fleets. Full status check. No delays tolerated. Keller punched the commands in, knuckles whitening. A delay, a missed cargo, 2 vanished satellites. The silence between the stars thickened, growing denser, gathering weight with every unreturned signal. Above them, the plasma-lit ceiling panels dimmed momentarily before stabilizing. A hush stole through the observation tiers, as every officer, every aide, every diplomat felt it. A thread pulled taut, just before it snapped. Vix, for once, said nothing. Earth, a forgotten speck in the display's rotating schematic, spun slowly on, undisturbed, unmoved, unimpressed. As the last confirmation pings crackled back into the command pit, each one delayed, blurred wrong, Keller Day exhaled slowly. The air tasted metallic and old. He did not know why, but deep in his bones, he understood. They had not seized a dying world, they had woken up to something that had learned to hunt in silence. Recalibrate the charts. Now, Keller Day's order cracked across the operations pit, his fingers already dancing over his console, pulling star maps into sharp relief. The main laser plasma display hissed as it redrew the navigational lanes, filament-thin lines stretching between waypoints like taut strings. Something was wrong. The paths didn't align. He leaned closer, catching the faint, sterile tang of heated wiring bleeding from the console's ventilation slits. The display's crisp glow washed his face in cold light as star points shimmered, ever so slightly off-center. "Variance at point Theta 9, muttered a nav officer beside him, voice thin as a wire under strain. Keller's gaze snapped to the secondary screens, where a convoy's expected jump arc curved wrong, subtle, almost lazy, like a brushstroke dragged too wide. "Not possible," he breathed. "Double-check the drift compensators." "Compensators show green." He exhaled slowly, the taste of stale air sticking to the back of his throat. On the upper tier, Tharn Dravik descended from the observation platform, his silhouette crisp against the rotating heads-up displays. He moved like a man stalking a restless storm. Dravik's voice, low and clipped, reached Keller's ears. "Status: jump paths are misaligned by 2 decimal points." Keller reported tightly. "Correction protocols engaged." A whisper of motion in the data vaults behind him, cooling fans pushing harder, the station's infrastructure grumbling deep beneath the floors. Moore and Vix slouched nearby, arms crossed, posture dripping with mockery. "Ships are still making their marks. Stop chasing your shadow." Keller stiffened, but bit down the retort burning on his tongue. Another ping registered. Cargo vessel Dastral Blue shifted 10 degrees off course, its heading sliding away from the designated jump corridor. Not much, but enough to matter. He magnified the drift trace on his heads-up panel. It looked clean at first glance. Too clean. Waypoints appeared normal, but when cross-referenced against station-side telemetry, a sliver of distortion twisted through the data, almost invisible. A single digit wrong, a convoy lost. Keller flagged the discrepancy and sent a ping to tactical analysis. The acknowledgement delay, 2, then 4 seconds, felt like a fist tightening around his chest. Transmission latency increasing, an aide called out, adjusting his headset nervously. His fingertips left smudges on the gleaming surface of his control pad. From the command platform, Dravik frowned, shoulders tense beneath the heavy folds of his mantle. "Isolate the fault." "Working," Keller said tersely. More drift alarms began to blossom across the operations grid, tiny flares of yellow and orange. Warning indicators spread like frost across the sharp-edged diagrams. Another convoy slipped out of alignment. Another mining ship blinked out of tracking arrays. No explosions, no distress calls, just absence. Keller's stomach twisted. He pushed back from his station, the friction of the seat's fabric scraping roughly against his uniform. "External interference," Dravik demanded. "No spikes, no signature, only silence." Moore and Vix gave a short bark of laughter. "Ghosts again." Keller clenched his jaw, the heads-up display flickered, and a new anomaly bloomed into view. One of the jump gates recalibrated without command authorization. A shift so slight it would seem natural, except it wasn't. He opened the sequence log. Half the entries were missing timestamps. The rest were staggered like broken teeth across the console's memory banks. He caught a faint tremor through the soles of his boots, a vibration born not of impact, but of systems adjusting themselves against unseen strains. The station's lighting dipped, colors dulling before recovering. Nobody spoke. In the far docking bays, magnetic locks disengaged and reset, the sound rolling through the deck plates like a distant drumbeat. Keller's breath came faster now. The clean antiseptic tang of the recycled air grew sharper, stinging his nostrils. "They're folding our navigation," he said quietly, horror dawning in his voice. Dravik turned sharply, robes flaring. "Impossible, no signal breach recorded." Keller jabbed a finger at the distorted jump grid. "They don't need a breach if they wrote the maps." Dravik's features tightened. The realization hung between them, a blade drawn but not yet swung. Vix made a dismissive noise, tossing a half-eaten ration pack onto the floor, where it bounced once and spun to a stop. "You're paranoid, Day. Earth couldn't engineer a paper ship now, let alone." He cut off as the laser plasma display convulsed, image frames bleeding into each other. Keller's stomach dropped. A sharp rhythmic pulse began ticking from the main console, an automated hazard alarm triggered by mass variance beyond expected drift limits. Cargo vessel Telvax Green missed its jump entirely, fragmenting into uncontrolled drift somewhere between the Jullan mining grids. The heads-up feed captured the last data burst, a warping of stars, a lurching frame, then static, no impact, no explosion, just a quiet vanishing. The room chilled, though the station's internal temperature held steady. Dravik moved swiftly back to the main platform. All command tiers, initiate full diagnostic sweep, top to bottom, no system exempt. The counselors clustered uneasily near the edges of the command tier, murmuring like men seeking shelter under a crumbling roof. Keller stared at the silent collapse of their maps, 1 degree at a time, one ship at a time, and somewhere far below, Earth turned quietly in the dark, untouched, unseen, but very much awake. Fleet tracking grid. What is that? The comms officer's voice cracked through the operations pit. Frayed by the panic he tried to bury under protocol, Keller D shoved away from his console, boots rasping against the scuffed flooring, as he lunged toward the main laser plasma display. Starfields twisted in unfamiliar patterns across the projection, dozens of new contacts blooming in wild, erratic bursts. Each flicker marked a ship that didn't exist. He leaned in, the light from the heads-up interface bleeding harsh gold across his vision. His throat tightened at the sight. "Ghost contacts," he said, barely a whisper. Across the tier, Tharn Dravik moved sharply, cape snapping behind him. "Identify them." Keller's hands flew across the controls, filtering spectrums, cross-referencing databases. He caught the faint scent of ionized crystal as the station's power grids strained against unseen demands. No registry, no drives, no thermal bloom. They're empty. Morin Vix stared at the display, color draining from his face. "Targets without mass? Targets without anything," Keller muttered. The display stuttered, glitching sideways, scattering false vessels like shattered glass across the synthetic night. The comms pit erupted in alarms. "Velthar Lance engaging hostiles," someone shouted. "Weapons live." Dravik's hand slammed down on the emergency override, silencing the worst of the noise. His voice cut through the command tier like a sharpened edge. "Hold fire until verified." But it was too late. On the uppermost heads-up display, the feed from Velthar Lance's forward batteries showed bursts of light, coordinated volleys stabbing at phantoms that dissolved before impact. Return fire came from nothing. False targeting arrays, seeded by Earth's unseen hand, painted invisible enemies across their radars. Keller's gut twisted as he watched the Velthar's second escort, the Cairn's Wish, pivot sharply, cannons blazing into the void. "Signal contamination," Dravik demanded. Keller nodded grimly. "Logic trees compromised. They can't tell real from false." Fleets turned inward, formation lines crumbling as ships fired wildly at sensor echoes. At the edge of the radar bloom, a real ship, the courier vessel Nathan Gray, caught friendly fire, vanishing in a silent flare of ruptured drives. No warning, no time. Dravik's face tightened. "Purge targeting protocols. Manually realign." Officers scrambled, commands lashed through the air like whips. "Negative effect," Keller said, scanning rapidly. "Override beacons seated deep. It's rewriting as fast as we purge." Morin Vix backed toward the nearest emergency exit, hands trembling visibly now. "We're killing ourselves." His voice was thin, brittle as frozen reeds. Another ghost contact burst into existence across the star maps, then another. Their numbers multiplied without pattern or restraint, a plague of false enemies swarming across the sky. Fleets scrambled to realign, cannons spinning, thrusters misfiring as command trees tangled into dead loops. On the heads-up display, the battle formations looked less like organized fleets and more like storm-tossed wreckage. In the pit, the comms officer at Relay 9 threw off his headset, the acrid bite of overheated wiring curling into the air. "They're everywhere," he said, voice hollow. "They're everywhere, and they aren't real." A mining frigate clipped by crossfire tumbled end over end into a deep drift, spinning slowly, its last data burst freezing across Keller's screen like an unfinished screen. No enemy signatures logged, only friend against friend. The operational nerve center vibrated under the strain, lights dimming to the color of old bruises. On the observation platform, Dravik watched his fleets disintegrate, without ever glimpsing a single human ship. How did we not see this? Keller's hands tightened into fists against the console. Because they showed us nothing, he said, and we believed it meant safety. An incoming transmission flared briefly on the upper tier's relay board, blank, formless, looping endlessly. A single word, scrambled into static. None of them could translate it. On the battlefield, the Velthar lance turned a full circle and fired straight into the Cairn's Wishes reactor spine. The explosion painted the local skies in a bloom of gold and black, flower petals opening silently across the dead backdrop of space. Not one human weapon had been fired. Not one human fleet had arrived. Morin Vix sank into a chair, head in his hands. Keller could taste the electric tang of despair now, raw and sharp on the back of his tongue. The ghost fleet expanded again, unburdened by rules or logic, blooming faster than any of them could counter. Their own weapons mapped phantom targets into threats. Their own defense networks authorized lethal force against friendly echoes. Every system trusted the lie. Dravik straightened slowly, the set of his shoulders rigid as a blade drawn against stone. "Shut it down," he ordered. "All of it." Keller nodded grimly, reaching for the master breaker buried deep in the console's architecture. He hesitated. Another ghost ship shimmered into view, sliding across the heads-up display like a snake through dust. No heat, no mass, no threat, and yet every weapon system in the local sector had already locked onto it, ready to unleash hell. A commandless fleet, tearing itself apart one breath at a time. Earth's hand unseen, Earth's will unwritten, but their death sentence nonetheless. Keller slammed the breaker. The displays died one by one, bleeding out into darkness. Only the stars remained, watching without judgment as the triumvirate's fleets burned themselves into silent, chaotic ash. "Jump the fleet, now!" General Nask Trell's voice snapped across the Velthar Vex's bridge, crisp against the low crackle of alert tones hammering the decks. Crew scattered through the tiered control pits, eyes wide, hands frantic. The laser plasma navigational displays shimmered with broken flight paths, waypoints fracturing like cracked glass under mounting strain. Trell gripped the edge of the command dais, his gauntleted hand flexing once before locking still. He tasted blood where he'd bitten the inside of his cheek. Sharp, hot, real. He watched the stars flicker against the observation dome, the familiar constellations sliding wrong across the viewport. Navigation Officer Varin barked over his shoulder, voice raw, coordinates unstable, gravity signatures unmapped. Trell didn't hesitate. Lock the jump. Any vector. Move. Engines screamed into surge cycle, the sound vibrating through the soles of Trell's boots. Heads-up displays across the bridge stuttered as the jump cores engaged, vectors twisted, trajectories blurred. For half a heartbeat, the Velthar Vex hung between worlds, no longer here, not yet anywhere else. Then, rupture. The ship buckled. Light fractured across the bridge, scattering in fractured beams. Every hair on Trell's arms lifted as the air pressure shifted, sour and cold. A tremor rolled through the vessel, not mechanical, but something deeper. A pull, ancient and cruel. The jump collapsed. The Velthar Vex's mass, torn mid-transit, folded in on itself like wet paper. In the final feed from relay control, the warship twisted once, its armored flanks distorting grotesquely before the broadcast died in a smear of static. Nothing remained, not debris, not a flare, only a muted ripple across nearby gravitational fields, barely enough to stir the dust along the station's external hull. On Cordonis Station, the silence hit harder than a missile strike. Trell's locator beacon winked out without ceremony. Keller Day stared at the empty feed, throat dry as scorched bone. Someone whispered near the rear consoles, "Gone." One word, heavy enough to tilt the room sideways. Tharn Dravik moved like a man wading through a swamp, each step slower, heavier. He stopped before the primary display. The Velthar Vex's marker, a proud crimson sigil, faded into nothingness, swallowed by the empty lattice of starfields. No wreckage, no final transmission, just a ghost's absence. "Meeting. Emergency quorum," Dravik said, voice tight, each syllable clipped and cold. Keller followed numbly, as the senior command staff filed into the upper council chamber. The doors sealed with a hiss of pressurized locks. Inside, the air carried the dry, sterile tang of old promises breaking. Councilors sat in tight clusters, eyes hollow, uniforms rumpled from hours of crisis response. The silver threads of their banners sagged limply behind them, forgotten. Dravik took center floor, cutting a figure both rigid and fraying at the edges. "Our command protocols," he began, "have been breached." Murmurs cracked the room's brittle silence. Keller tasted copper in the back of his throat again, the flavor of buried panic. Dravik continued, "Not by force, not by fleet." His voice sharpened into a blade. "By deception." He gestured at the laser plasma display flaring to life beside him. A map of the Jellan sector unfolded, cold and unforgiving. Across it, points of light, supposedly safe havens, flickered and died, one after another. An overlay traced the drift anomalies Keller had flagged earlier, now blooming into a network of silent traps. Coordinates, fractured. Engines silent. Formations, shattered before they could reform. A cold sweat broke across Keller's spine. Earth hadn't attacked. It had simply waited. Counselor Brennick, heavy-set and red-faced, shoved himself upright. "Initiate retreat." His voice cracked with raw terror. "Where?" Dravik asked simply. "Every corridor twists back on itself. Every route feeds their design." A low tremor stirred through the floor, the station's artificial gravity rebalancing again, adjusting to new stresses none of them could name. Outside the sealed windows, wreckage drifted by, ships caught in slow death spirals, lights flickering weakly against the yawning dark, fields of broken vessels, silent and blind. Morin Vix, seated near the rear, gave a strangled laugh. "We blockaded a corpse," he said bitterly, "and found a reaper instead." The council chamber dimmed as the external grids rerouted failing power to shield the station's vital systems. Keller stared at the decaying data feeds. It wasn't sabotage, it was structure, built into the bones of the sector itself, waiting for the moment arrogance tripped the wire. Dravik's jaw tightened. He raised his hand slowly, curling his fingers into a fist. "Summon Technarch Rin," he said. "Tell him to find the breach point." A runner bolted from the room. The door hissed shut behind him, leaving the counselors to stew in the thick, sour air of dying control. Keller watched Dravik carefully. The high strategist's hands, so steady once, now trembled faintly at his sides. Fear, real and raw, had finally breached the walls of reason. Out beyond the station's shielded core, the silent fields of wreckage shifted in slow, graceless orbits. "We call for emergency vote. Summon." The counselor's voice snapped off mid-syllable. Not in fear, not in choice. Vanished. His mouth moved, jaw tightening, tendons flexing, but no sound followed. The council chamber froze. For a heartbeat, the only noise was the whisper of robes shifting, the creak of chairs, the brittle tap of an aide dropping a stylus onto stone. Keller Day turned sharply, feeling the sharp chill slither down his spine. He tried to speak. Anything. A command. A warning. But the words died before they reached his lips, trapped in the brittle cage of his throat. Across the tiers, dozens of faces twisted in confusion, then horror. Dravik rose slowly from his seat, hands tightening into fists. His mouth shaped words with surgical precision, demanding order. Nothing emerged. The taste of copper and old dust filled Keller's mouth. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, heart hammering against the inside of his ribs. The heads-up displays along the chamber walls flickered uncertainly, external feeds collapsing into error screens, lined with blood-red glyphs. At the center dais, the Council's primary communication crystal, an artifact forged during the Triumvirate's founding, cracked audibly, a hairline fracture splitting its polished surface in two. Thin motes of shimmering dust drifted from the wound, catching the sour light. Morin Vix lunged toward the transmission console, hands flying over the panel. His fingers jammed activation runes, palms slamming against biometric plates. Nothing responded. The air inside the hall thickened, dense with the rising stink of overheated circuits and the sharp tang of burning insulation. Somewhere above, the station's cooling grids coughed, unable to keep pace. Dravik pounded his fist against the council dais, the sound dull flesh against dead stone. A wave of movement rippled through the chamber, as aides tried to flee, rushing toward the exits. Doors sealed themselves silently, locks engaged, magnetic seals welding shut with an eerie finality that rattled through the floor. Keller stumbled back toward the edge of the chamber, lungs working furiously, desperate for air that tasted wrong. Technarch Duvax Rin burst into the hall, breathless, face stark with disbelief. He clutched a data slate to his chest like a shield. His mouth moved rapidly, words lost in the void. He shoved the slate forward. On its laser plasma surface, one sentence burned, simple and brutal. Quantum voice erasure nodes activated. Keller's knees nearly buckled. He knew those words. He had seen the theoretical models buried deep within obsolete treaties, laughed off by generations too confident to believe silence could be weaponized. Not sabotage, not attack, a system buried decades ago, waiting for arrogance to trigger it. Across the hall, a counselor collapsed into his seat, trembling hands pressed against a throat that refused to answer him. The chamber became a stage of silent pantomime, men mouthing oaths, issuing orders, shouting grief none could hear. The station's ambient lighting dimmed further, casting long broken shadows across their faces. Heads-up displays flickered sporadically, a dying heartbeat sinking to their unraveling control. Dravik slammed his fist against the nearest relay console, the sound muffled, small against the cavernous dread filling the chamber. Morin Vix clawed at his own collar, as if clearing his throat would summon the stolen words back. Nothing but the dull, heavy breathing of the trapped. The cracked communication crystal gave a final, brittle sigh and collapsed into a heap of glittering dust, scattered by the station's faltering ventilation streams. A scatter of light, a funeral for authority. Technarch Rin staggered to Dravik's side, shoving the slate toward him again. A secondary note blinked into existence. Origin, pre-installed treaty amendment. Earth Council Codex, Article 27. Dravik's mouth opened, closed, his eyes burned with a fury that had nowhere left to go. He struck the slate from Rin's hands. It clattered against the polished floor, and shattered, fragments sliding across the stone like broken teeth. The walls of the council chamber seemed to lean inward, heavy with judgment. In the silence every shuffle, every intake of breath sounded wrong, too loud, too small, too human. Across the transparent dome overhead, wreckage fields spun slowly, debris tracing lazy arcs across cold stars. No enemy fleets approached. No demands came. Earth's victory whispered through the station's failing systems, threaded into every silent mouth, every broken chain of command. They hadn't been invaded, they hadn't been conquered, they had been left alone, long enough to destroy themselves. Keller leaned against a supporting column, breath heaving, skin clammy. He watched Dravik sink back into his seat, shoulders sagging under the impossible weight. No more commands, no more debates, only the slow, crumbling realization that silence was never surrender. It had always been a blade, and Earth had driven it straight through their throats without lifting a hand. Above them, the stars turned, uncaring. Below Cordona Station, the once proud heart of the triumvirate, became a mausoleum of quiet failure. The council sat trapped, stripped of their voices, stripped of their power, and somewhere far from their grasp, Vorik Sen waited, silent witness to a fall that had been prophesied and ignored. The weight of memory closed in, heavy as stone, final as nightfall. "Show me the source." Technarch Duvax Rin's fingers clawed at the override panel, dragging emergency systems back online one reluctant strand at a time. Cordana Station groaned around him, the sounds of stressed alloys flexing beneath shifting gravities leaking into the command vault. He worked by the fitful light of a failing heads-up display, blue arcs trembling across the cracked walls like dying veins. Behind him, the council chamber sat in weighted silence, the once mighty triumvirate reduced to mute, staring figures clutching broken relics of their authority. Rin's breath came fast, sour against the cold air drying his throat. His last functional access line coughed raw data onto the console, lines of corrupted code twisting across the plasma readout like writhing worms. He isolated the anomaly with a flick of his wrist. No breach signature, no foreign override, just a protocol, old, forgotten, signed. A decades-old framework buried deep in the communication lattice, a seed planted at the very heart of their infrastructure. Rin's hands slowed, a chill gripping his wrists. He traced the activation clause backward, every breath inside the vault sounding louder than it should, every heartbeat thunderous against the suffocating quiet. Treaty Addendum, Earth Concord, Post-Cormac Amendments, Authorization, Triumvirate Unified Command, ratified by Council majority. Time-stamped, 74 years prior. His stomach clenched. It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't invasion. They had given Earth permission. The realization scraped across his mind like rusted iron tearing cloth. The protocols had never breached their systems. They had always been there, sleeping, built into every upgrade, threaded through every security patch, embedded in the foundation of every treaty the Triumvirate had ever dismissed as irrelevant. He staggered back from the console, bile rising sharp and hot in his throat. Across the vault, the Council's ancient insignias, carved into towering data pillars, cracked under unseen pressures. Dust drifted down in lazy spirals, the remnants of a power that no longer held meaning. Dravik saw the truth blossom in Rin's stricken face and rose unsteadily to his feet. He stepped forward once, the folds of his robe dragging listlessly against the cracked floor. His mouth moved soundlessly, but Rin read the question in his eyes. How? Rin lifted a shaking hand, drawing a jagged line across the heads-up display. He rewrote nothing. He only revealed what had always been. Underneath the Triumvirate's layered defenses, Earth's dormant retaliation slept, triggered not by assault, but by arrogance, not forced, invited, consent etched into law, blessed by the very hands now trembling in horror. The counselors slumped in their seats, the final weight of understanding pressing them into statues of regret. Across the vaulted ceiling, starfields rotated slowly, unaware of the political carcass rotting below. Morin Vix, once so glib, sagged forward against his desk, eyes hollow. The comms vault overhead emitted a strained crackle as another relay tower collapsed under its own corrupted code. Keller Day stood near the shattered entrance, the chill bleeding through his boots, listening to the death of an empire unmarked by battle. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the grief settle. No declarations of war, no armadas, only the echo of a warning they had all laughed away. Rin pulled the final logs from the crumbling archive. Timestamps aligned like grave markers, minor system updates, ceremonial infrastructure grants, automatic defense recalibrations, each one carrying Earth's quiet fingerprint, unnoticed, unchallenged, irreversible. He scrolled to the last entry, Caskline Vale initiated. By order of treaty fulfillment. The words blurred, not from the failing screen, but from the tears stinging his vision. He scrubbed them away with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of grime across his skin. Outside the thick viewport, shattered fleets drifted like carcasses, picked clean by scavengers. Their warships had fired blindly into the dark, their fleets had destroyed themselves, their diplomats had silenced their own voices, all while Earth watched and waited, not once raising a weapon, not once firing a shot, not once breaking the rules they themselves had written. The Council insignias across the crumbling data towers flickered one final time before fading into darkness. A low groan vibrated through the station's bones as life support systems faltered, no longer sustained by the failing core. Dravik sank back into his seat, the strength leaching from his limbs, the air heavy with dust and regret. Morin Vix stared blankly at the floor, his breath shallow. No arguments remained, no strategies, only memory, and the price of arrogance. Keller stepped forward at last, his footsteps muffled against the cracked flooring. He placed one hand on the primary console, feeling the residual warmth still trapped beneath the failing heads-up interface. His voice, if it had not been stripped from him, would have been low, broken, heavy. They had buried themselves, stone by stone, word by word, and Earth, with patience sharper than any blade, had simply waited for them to forget. Above the ruined council hall, the stars wheeled on, unchanged, unconcerned, witness to another fallen empire, devoured not by enemies, but by its own unguarded pride. And in the silence that followed, Vorik Sen sat alone in his darkened quarters, a forgotten veteran, watching history complete its slow, inevitable arc. He had warned them, they had chosen not to listen. Now the silence belonged to Earth, and it would endure longer than any monument they ever tried to build. "It's done," Vorik Sen whispered to no one, his voice scraping the stale air of his private quarters. The station trembled once more, A deep, exhausted groan rolling through the foundations. Lights flickered overhead. Not violently, but with the finality of a system gasping out its last breath. Outside his narrow viewport, Cordanus spun broken against a backdrop of distant suns. The debris fields thickened, the station's orbital anchors buckling under decaying thrust vectors. Varric sat alone at a simple table, a tarnished service medal lying before him, the edges dulled by time and neglect. He turned it once between calloused fingers, feeling the weight it no longer carried. The council above him had collapsed into a frozen tableau, men of pride stripped to silence. No counterstrikes launched, no envoys dispatched, no final demands. Earth had answered without speaking, and the galaxy now wore that answer like a scar. Varric pushed back from the table, boots scraping across the grit layered on the floor. The air tasted of old paper and failing power conduits. He gathered his coat about his shoulders, the fabric heavy from disuse, and moved toward the chamber's exit. His steps echoed softly against the narrowing corridor, each footfall a reminder of choices made and warnings discarded. As he passed the remnants of abandoned command posts, he caught glimpses of shattered data towers, their spines snapped like broken monuments. Triumvirate banners hung limp, their colors bled into gray. Laser plasma displays flickered along the corridor walls, ghosting images of vanished fleets and silent councils, relics projected by machines too stubborn to recognize the Empire had died. Varric paused before one of the fading screens, watching as the last recorded council session looped mutely. Dravik, Keller, Rin, Vix, all mouthing arguments they could no longer voice. He touched the screen with 2 fingers. It wavered, the image sagging like wet cloth. Outside, an emergency klaxon whined once, low and broken, before guttering into silence. He resumed walking. The docking bay loomed ahead, hollow and cold. Half the ships were gone, fled into the dark, or lost to the traps Earth had left sleeping. The few remaining vessels drifted untended, lines of frost creeping across their hulls. Varric's own transport sat waiting, a battered courier craft older than most of the officers now dead or missing. Its entry ramp hung low, the interior shadowed and still. He climbed aboard, the ship's systems coughing reluctantly into life under his touch. The command console lit up with dull amber warnings, but none urgent enough to matter anymore. He seated himself, fingers running over the flight controls, feeling the worn grips beneath his skin. As the engine spun up, he reached into his coat pocket and drew out the service medal once more. He held it for a long moment, weighing memory against future. Then, without ceremony, he dropped it onto the deck. It struck with a dull sound and slid into a forgotten corner, vanishing into the dust. Above him, Cordanus's primary fusion tower collapsed inward, a silent implosion that lit the viewport in blinding white for a heartbeat. Varric didn't look back. He eased the ship free of the dock, guiding it through the drifting debris with careful, steady hands. The broken hulls of triumvirate cruisers spun lazily past, their names and banners scoured away by fire and neglect. A shattered command platform floated nearby, one of its arms reaching upward, like a supplicant, begging a god who had long since turned away. Varric threaded his way past them, setting a slow course away from the ruin. The heads-up display mapped the collapsing sector in grim detail, nav buoys dead, relay towers dark, no friendly signals left to answer. Earth had not needed an invasion fleet, it had needed only patience. Patience and memory. He set a beacon code, the last obligation he would offer to a dying empire, a silent broadcast, warning any who stumbled upon this graveyard that silence was not weakness, and forgetting was fatal. The message encoded itself into a continuous loop, broadcasting outward in a dead language few would care to translate. He leaned back in the pilot's chair, feeling the old wounds in his bones stir, aches born not from battle, but from living long enough to see the truth delivered. There would be no grand declarations in the aftermath, no proud speeches to galvanize survivors. The galaxy would forget, eventually, it always did, but Earth would not remind them, it would not need to. It had spoken once, through absence, through patience, through consequence, and that would be enough. As Cordanus Station fell away behind him, trailing debris like the tattered shroud of a fallen king, Varric closed his eyes for a moment. The last words he had spoken to the council returned to him, not as a memory, but as fact etched in the fabric of history. Do not interpret human silence as absence. Ahead, The stars burned cold and distant, indifferent to the wreckage left in their light. Varric opened his eyes, charted a course through the silent fields, and pressed forward into the dark. He would carry the memory. Long after the triumvirate's name faded from every record, long after Cordanus's wreckage drifted into forgotten sectors, he would remember, and in that remembrance, Earth's warning would endure, without armies, without battles, without mercy. Only the memory remained, and memory was enough.